Hello, World Singers. My name is Brooke.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is
Cosmere Conversations. Welcome back, friends from all around. It has been a journey since Wind and Truth because we've been looking deep into the lore, into the history, back into time, moving us forward to the actual plot of Stormlight Archive, and we are now finally here. Like, we have caught up in our episodes to bring you into the true essence of Wind and Truth, the actual things that are happening during the time that the characters are experiencing them, when so much of our previous episodes have been focused on the past and what happened and was learned in the spiritual realm.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that after all of these episodes, so many hours of recording, we really haven't even talked about our main characters, you know, our Kaladins, our Shalans, our Dalinars, etc. And we're still kind of not in this episode because this is going to be sort of the conclusion up until this point of all of the events that we have spoken about so far, which will include a new vessel for honor as well as an entirely new shard.
Last time we left off, we were discussing the era of solitude and this period after Aharietium when Odium and Honor, for different reasons, kind of retreat from the battlefield. Mishram, Ba-Ado-Mishram, takes up some of the power of Odium and installs herself as like a ruler of or leader of the Singer population. That conflict with the Knights Radiant that eventually gets to the point about 2,000 years before the events of the Stormlight Archive. We have Gareth and Shimone, their love story, their relationship that tragically ends in the capturing of Mishram. That event triggers the recreance and the end of the Knights Radiant.
Yeah, and then it's somewhat stagnant for those, 2,000 years, with the shards sort of in stasis the way that they are. Honor without a vessel, Odium doing his Odium thing, but trapped on the planet. The Singers have become Parshmen. There are no Knights Radiant, and humans are just living their human lives.
I think importantly to state is that the Stormfather, with a bit of Tanavas cognitive shadow dropped off inside of him, is looking for a champion. And that will be what we expect, some type of continual search until they arrive at Dalinar Kholin. That kind of brings us into today's episode, which I think we're probably going to call, or at least I'm going to call, the birth of Retribution. Because long ago, when we were first discussing our hot takes after reading Wind and Truth, I said it kind of recontextualized for me the entirety of the Stormlight Archive as this journey of Taravangian into becoming Odium, into becoming Retribution, and how important that story was that was always like subtly done. But now with the conclusion of Wind and Truth, it's not subtle. It's like very obvious and in our face that Retribution is a huge part of the Cosmere lore going forward. And that means that we have so much to talk about. We have magic, we have history, we have characters, and this is going to be a dense episode, but I think a really fun one.
Yeah, and I hope it's going to be helpful. There's so much happening at the end of Wind and Truth that hopefully this kind of gives a good recap of exactly what was going on in terms of the shards and then the sort of larger implications of what happens with them.
Now, before we dive in too deep into the lore pool, as it were, I want to give a special shout out to all of our patrons over on Patreon. We did a little bit of a raffle giveaway last month and had several new members join up. Thank you to everyone for joining up over on the Patreon, but it was in part inspired by longtime patron Dorksider, who was willing to donate a signed Katie Payne artwork of Vin and Tensoon. We have a winner. Craig T., you were the selected patron for this artwork, and we thank you all. We thank Craig T., we thank Katie Payne, we thank Dorksider, we thank Brandon Sanderson. We're just on a thankful trip here. You can always join us over on Patreon. It's very meaningful to have that outlet and that mechanism of communicating directly with fans. If you want to communicate with us, guess what? That's the best way to do it. But I also want to say that we're entering into the summer months with our June, July, and August. Guess what we do in the summer, Brooke? Every summer since we started 8 years ago.
Most summers, anyway. It is our birthday season, and the only thing that we ask from you, our wonderful audience, is that if you haven't, rate and review the podcast for us on the platform of your choosing. Let us know what you think, if you like it, how much you like it, what you like about it. Super helpful for the podcast, as well as really helpful for helping other people find the podcast so that those lonely Cosmere fans out there searching for something to fill the gaps in between books can find our podcast.
Yes, if you want to communicate and be communicated with directly with Brooke and I, Patreon is probably your best bet. But if you just want to know that I'm going to read what you write, leave a review, because I read all of those. You know the advice where they're like, never read the reviews, don't read the comments. I ignore that advice. If you are leaving a review, I go out and hunt it down, the good ones, the bad ones, but I know all of you, 5 stars only, 5 thumbs up. That's what we're looking for. We love you all. Thank you so much for being listeners, and we are only going to really overemphasize the rating and reviewing for these next couple of birthday months.
It's the only time of year we ask.
And anybody can do that. It has nothing to do with paying or joining over on Patreon. This is just normally hitting a quick button on your phone or something.
Wherever it's possible to leave a rating, you can do so. Thanks.
And with that, I think that we should start with this conflict. Okay, Dalinar has been chosen as Honor's successor. He doesn't even know.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, let's go back. I mean, this is really the conclusion, the climax of the entire Stormlight Archive up until this point is this contest of champions, right? The entire book has led us in these 10 days leading up to this conflict. It finally arrives, and Dalinar ascends to the top of Urithiru, armed only with a book. Just makes me cry every time.
Quote, "That's what the path of gods has shown me, Sabariel. I can't just protect Alethkar. I have to find a way to defeat him fully."
How will you storming do that?
With oaths and light, Sabariel. Navani had placed Dalinar's copy of The Way of Kings on a table. He smiled, slipped it off, and carried it in one hand as he strode up the stairs. End quote.
Wow, I love it so much.
Because it is reminiscent, and he calls this out shortly thereafter, of his moment in Oathbringer in Thaylen City when he, for the first time, creates a perpendicularity and is standing against all evil, you know, this force of all power as just a man with a book. And
and I think sort of representative of how in times of stress or difficulty, we can tend to cling to the sort of symbols of the person that we want to be in those moments. We hold tight to our ideals, our oaths, this concept of the kind of person that we want to enter this stressful scenario as. And I think that that's what this is representing. He doesn't necessarily know how he's going to even approach this conflict. He still doesn't really understand what the conflict is or how he's going to solve the problem. And bringing this book with him is just a commitment to be the type of person that he has learned how to be, that he wants to be, regardless of what the outcome is, regardless of what the decisions are that he's about to make.
He has this to say about the moment in Thalin's city, quote, believing his book and its words would shield him. That had ended with burning pages and a god demanding his obedience. Yet the words on the page hadn't mattered, had they? For those words had migrated to his heart, end quote. And without getting too personal in this moment, I think that why this signature moment of Dalinar's at Thalin Field is so meaningful is because, from my perspective, you can't just show up with the book on game day or in the big moment. You cannot have the most meaningful decision in your life and simply make the correct decision at that time.
Yeah.
It has to be about the words had migrated to his heart, the experiences that he had had.
Yeah, practice.
Yeah. Exactly. You need to practice in the small moments. You need to live by the words and the oaths of the Way of Kings.
So that when those intense, difficult moments arise, you're able to respond in the way that you want to respond because you've practiced it. You've practiced being that person.
Completely agree. And Dalinar does it again. He does it again at Wind and Truth, kind of like believing in himself, trusting himself with perhaps more confidence going into this scene than he had in Oathbringer, which was like a little defeatist. He was like, you know, I'm going to kind of do this and maybe it'll work out. But I think in this moment, when he's talking to Sabariel, he's saying like, I got it. Like my experiences have led me to this moment. Doesn't mean that I'm 100% certain of victory, but I'm confident in myself. I'm confident in what I learned. And I'm going to take the thing that is now more like a totem than a dictionary that I need to like look up. What does honor mean? No, he knows it. He feels it. And he takes that energy up to the top of the tower and faces off with Old Man Taravangian, which he loves to portray himself as, the wizened king Taravangian with a little bit more flair, a little bit more gold, but at the end of the day, he often does not overly display his godlike power.
He certainly hasn't changed the look of his avatar. He is still appearing as the old man that he was as a human. And Taravangian doesn't waste much time. He reveals that his champion is none other than Gavinor, armed with Dalinar's old Shardblade Oathbringer.
This
so
is
sort of these two punches to the gut.
Of course, like using the blade that Dalinar carried for so many years.
His glory and his shame.
And also technically his grandnephew, but at this point, Dalinar refers to Gavinor as his grandson.
Yeah.
And I think that this was a major bit of speculation going into Wind and Truth, you know, who is going to be Odium's champion. I think this moment for me is one of the most devastating and one of the most truly evil things on display within the entirety of the Stormlight Archive.
I know it's pretty polarizing in the fandom, the way that people felt about Gavinor being the champion. There was a lot of speculation before the book came out because of a specific death rattle that it would be Gavinor. And I'm pretty sure I'm on record saying, like, that doesn't make any sense. Gavinor is only like 8 years old. Like, how would that even work?
And let's describe very quickly how that works. Could you read that for us?
Quote, 20 years in the spiritual realm, Dalinar, passed as an hour in this realm. That's where Gavinor lived after you abandoned him. End quote.
So there's a switcheroo, right? And
Yes.
Navani walks out of the spiritual realm with a facsimile, a fake Gavinor. A changeling of sorts. And the real Gavinor remains in the spiritual realm for 20 years, is raised and trained by Odium. To me, this is why it's so evil. This is why Odium is the true villain. This is the moment that should eliminate in anybody's mind the sweet old man Taravangian, who was maybe a little too utilitarian for anybody's liking. You know, he was a little bit too Thanos-y of just like, I'll do what's right and the greater good will prevail. But there was always kind of like a respect that people like Dalinar had for him.
Yes, this whole scene is certainly a progression of Taravangian fully revealing the depth of his evilness, badness. I think there were always questions, as you're saying, where there were moments or decisions that Taravangian made or certain theories that he espoused that would give a lot of us pause, but seemed to be well-reasoned and at least sort of coming from a good place. Like he was trying to get to a good outcome, even if we disagreed with the way that he was trying to get there. And by the end of this scene, obviously, every single aspect that we might be able to give him the benefit of the doubt on has been destroyed.
I've called out this moment previously, but I thought that Taravangian as Odium in the interludes of Wind and Truth was making a lot of sense. He called out cultivation as like, this is your fault, the fault not just of Corvellium Avast, but of all of the shards, that they did this to the people without recognition or taking responsibility for their actions. And I was kind of like, yeah, let him cook for a bit, let him go off on these shard powers that were too strong.
Oh, you thought it was good to have like fresh blood
basically
in the shards.
Yeah, and I thought he was correctly identifying, as I've said multiple times, that the shards are bad. And so I was still willing, even though he was Odium at that point, I was still willing to give some credit to Taravangian as a new god. And this is what completely convinced me that he is no longer redeemable. He's not coming back. There's no arc for Taravangian to become a better person or anything along those lines. I think taking someone, imprisoning them for 20 years, creating a false reality, and then maneuvering them into a position where or at least strongly believe that Dalinar is going to kill this child, and you're doing it all to make it difficult on Dalinar. Like, he doesn't think Gavinor is going to win.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is the best argument in favor of this ending that some people, as I said, have some issues with. Odium lays it right out and is like, I wanted to win. So, like, obviously I was going to give you two bad options. Like, I want to win. I'm going to give myself every chance to win. And I set it up so that I could win either way.
Exactly. The win either way, because it's like that move in tic-tac-toe where you give yourself two winning options regardless of what the other person does.
Right.
Like his plan was either, Dalinar, you kill your grandson and break your own spirit in doing so.
Yeah.
I quote unquote lose the bet, but I win you, Dalinar, and you become my minion basically, because it will corrupt you so much to perform this action. Or Gavinar kills you and I am released fully upon the Cosmere, and like the bet is won by me in full.
Well, I think more of the second option that he is assuming is that Dalinar will forfeit. Dalinar will just refuse to fight, and therefore
that's a loss as well.
Odium will win. Yeah.
I
don't think Taravangian ever is like, I think Gavinor is going to win this one in a fight.
Right. Win by default, we'll say.
Although, to be fair, he's also surprised that Dalinar shows up without any weapon. And is like, did you really come to a contest of champions without a single weapon and just a book? And then he even gives Dalinar a shard blade and is like, here, please fight.
Now, I do think something that is interesting to call out about this facsimile, this small Gavinor that Navani has, off in a room.
Yeah, sleeping
whatever.
on a couch somewhere.
Yeah, he says this, quote, I couldn't create something that would live and act like him. My powers in that area, creation, are limited, end quote.
Yeah, super interesting. This is his explanation for why the fake Gavinor has just been sleeping and hasn't been seeming like a walking, talking child.
And I find this concept of some shards are good at creating, some shards are less skilled at creating very interesting, maybe very meaningful for the rest of the Cosmere. I put this out to our patron Discord and some others around the community of like, which shards are good at creating, which ones are clearly not good at creating, or simply occupied some space after they became shards themselves.
Right.
Roshar is the obvious example. It existed previously. We just did a bunch of episodes about the beginning of Roshar before honor and cultivation show up. On the other hand, the opposite end of the spectrum is Scadrial, which had ruin and preservation show up into a system that had absolutely no planet at all, and they created the planet as well as all of its
So there
inhabitants.
wasn't really a system, I don't think. I think it was just like empty space. And
Yeah.
they made the system.
Exactly. I'm very hesitant to say like what is a system or not because I'm not an astrophysicist. I don't know if there was a sun and that they built the planet or they literally created everything like a solar system.
Right.
But for all intents and purposes, from nothing, ruin and preservation create everything on Scadrial. Nalthis is a little bit similar. Endowment is said to have created all of the humans at minimum on Nalthis. I don't know if she also created every bit of the planet like on Scadrial, but like that also means that there are other shards that are not that good at creation. Odium seems to be one of them.
Well, even ruin and preservation could only do it because they were together. Either one of them on their own, I don't think would be capable of creation. I think there's even a similar thing between honor and cultivation.
Definitely.
Where neither one of them would have been able to create something individually. Cultivation has a better chance of being able to, but I think that cultivation is defined as only being able to cultivate what already exists. So she can like build on existing things, but I don't know if she could have created whole cloth the spren and other beings that cultivation and honor bring into the world.
I completely agree. She's probably better at it. She's more capable. And I think all of the shards to a certain degree are capable of creation. It's not like they can't create at all.
I think probably most of them are like Odium in this regard, that they can kind of like make a thing, but it's not really life.
I would agree. It's like they can create something, a facsimile of life. They can create, for example, the Khandra and the Koloss. There's kind of like, there's life. There's definitely something there.
Well, yeah, because even that is not pure creation. That's more like a cultivation thing, building on something that already exists.
That's what I mean. It's like they can probably do that. Most of the shards can probably like take a little mist wraith, imagine how its biology works, infuse it with some hemalurgic spikes, and create, in quotes, a life form that is sentient.
Yeah, they can make a boxed cake, but they can't do it from scratch.
Ooh, just creating a little bit of Cosmere bake-off. I love it. Flashback up to the top of the tower, and Taravangian says this, quote, "Isn't this what you want? A battle you can win. But of course, I complicated it, didn't I? By bringing someone you don't want to kill. So inconvenient." End quote.
Yeah, that's the moment when it's just like, yeah, obviously, dude. Like, it's a contest. This isn't pretend. This isn't a exhibit bout. This isn't for looks. This isn't for a trophy.
Mm-hmm.
This is life and death, right? It's the difference between boxing match and a scuffle in an alley.
100%. That's a great explanation. Like either this is all quote unquote for show and nobody wants to kill anyone.
Right. Where there's like, you are fighting and you
Yes.
do want to win, but there are rules and there are standards, things that you're not going to do because it's custom, etc. Versus literally fighting for your life. There are no rules. You will do whatever it takes. And that is the situation that we're in.
Yes. And it's remarked that Rhaesa, as the vessel, actually imagined using Kaladin, who he failed to corrupt, and Moash. Maybe that also reflects a little bit like, what was Brandon thinking? But he comes to this change in heart with the change of vessel that like that is for show. Like you corrupt Kaladin and then you make Kaladin fight Dalinar as like this battle between the one who said that they were honorable and the one who's like still trying to live by those rules. Like that's all very cinematic.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I think that that's probably what a lot of people are feeling when they're dissatisfied with this ending. I think it is unsatisfying. We are so used to the dramatic, cinematic ending that is a little bit formulaic, right? Where our main characters come to the final climax and there's an epic battle that they win and we're all happy and we go home feeling great. And that's not what this is. I think that Sanderson really deftly circumvents a lot of the tropes that we see all the time and tells a more interesting story. This isn't going to end with a big epic battle that feels really satisfying in some way. The story is about who Dalinar is, who he's chosen to become, and like all of his life choices, which is even more dramatic and meaningful, just in a different way.
Meaningful in a different way. And Odium then kind of just stops the charade and straight up freezes Gavinor in the middle of the fight.
They don't even like try to fight for very long. It's 2 minutes maybe. Dalinar like hides a couple of times and is trying to duck because he doesn't have any weapons. And then finally Odium's like, that's good enough. Just like make your choice. And he says, quote, "The power of Odium and I have found one another. Its ambitions, my convictions. One God for all the Cosmere, putting right what was broken thousands of years ago by a group of fools." End quote.
Now, this is, to me, the peak moment of Odium, the peak danger, the absolute synergy between vessel and power that he's describing here is different from everything that we've seen with every other shard, in my opinion. It's different than all of the stuff that we just described over multiple episodes with Honor, and like how that was basically the vessel and the power disagreeing over time and like separating.
Disagreeing all the time.
Yes, but there were moments when Tanavas like forced the power back into alignment. In this moment, I think Odium is saying, if he's correct, he is saying we are 100% in alignment. One God, all the Cosmere, I'm going to do everything, and that's exactly what the power wants. To me, that's the most dangerous thing. It's what's not on display on a character we'll talk a lot more about in the future of Harmony. He is divided between the different intents of the shard. But in this moment, everything is in alignment, and though there is more power coming Teravangian's way, I don't know if there's more alignment, and I think that might be dangerous for him. Before we get to that, the actual birth, let's talk about Dalinar ascending to the position of honor.
Dalinar is faced with this terrible choice, and he thinks that he has come up with the right words to say to ascend to honor. Quote, "It is time, Dalinar." That was Cultivation's voice. "Speak the words. You know them now." He did. He fixated on the power's perspective, watching Tanavas betray it time and time again. He took to heart the lessons of his realm, that in this case the destination wasn't about a place, but about a connection. It was about who you had become, not about where you arrived. The power surrounded him, and he slammed his hands together, opening a perpendicularity. Then he spoke to Honor the most important words he might ever say. Words that only worked if he could say them truly. "I understand you." End quote.
I understand you as the beckoning motion for the power of honor.
Yes, because of course this sounds very similar to what we talked about last episode with the way that Unmade are able to be drawn into a gemstone, which is also mirrored in how Spren are drawn into gemstones or how Spren are used. And so that's sort of the microcosm, and then it goes all the way up to something as big as a shard. Once again, we see in Sanderson's work, empathy is magic. Empathy is the center seed of how everything is working.
Absolutely. And I love that concept of on the small scale and the same thing mirrored on the larger scale. Of course, interesting to note that if the most important words he can say in this moment are, "I understand you," that implies there is a you to be understood. Honor, the power at this point is not just power. It is a entity. And we've talked about this so many times, how power within the Cosmere wants to become sentient. It wants to think and feel and become a real boy, to use the Pinocchio phrase. At this point, the power of honor is somebody. It's not something. It's not just like amorphous power. I believe it is someone.
It has started to gain sentience in a way that in my impression is that shards will not gain their own sentience necessarily while being held by a vessel.
Exactly.
But because this shard has been vessel-less for so long, it is starting to develop its own sentience. I think maybe that's reading a little bit too much into I understand you, but it remains correct, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it is reading too much into it, because we're also going to see in a vision in just a moment the small child version of the power of honor. But I'm going to hold off just on that breakdown a little bit, because part of the reason why the power of honor is going to accept this call from Dalinar and eventually merge with Dalinar to become the new Shard of Honor is because of Renarin and Rlain, because of the fix to the horrific error that was made in capturing Ba-Ado-Mishram, and that violation maybe to the whole of Rashar, something deeper than just a violation among the shards or a disagreement among the shards.
Yeah, because when Dalinar first reaches out to the power, it hesitates. It's not totally sold on this new vessel. And that's partially because this new wannabe vessel is human. And the power has had bad experiences in the past with humans. But in this moment, at the same time, we have Renarin and Rlain working together to release Ba-Ado-Mishram, and their success at this, as well as the fact that they are working together, a human and a singer are working together to do it, finally convinces the power to take a chance on Dalinar. Quote, Dalinar felt the moment Renarin and Rlain released Ba-Ado-Mishram, a long-lasting discordant note vibrating the soul of Rashar in the most terrible of ways was finally extinguished, something that had been broken for so very long, righted. Dalinar strode toward Odium, the power of honor surrounding him. End quote.
Just a little bit later, we have, quote, fortunately, with the release of Mishram accomplished, her betrayal, the very thing that had broken Tanavast, the path became clear. That sin had been holding the power back all these centuries, but now it thirsted for a vessel, and Dalinar had seen its existence and its failings. End quote. Jumping forward just a little bit more, quote, it wanted someone who understood it. That was the budding humanity of it, the budding awareness. Like all sapient things, it wanted to be understood. And thus, with that connection, the power that had been ostracized at long last returned. End quote. Dalinar is able to understand, he's able to empathize, he is able to, with the assistance, the long distance assistance of his son and of Rlain, fixing a wrong that was done thousands of years prior to any of them existing. And it all coalesces in this moment as a new honor is elevated and ascended. With this new power, Dalinar is almost convinced to fight Odium. I think as anybody would. You're just feeling as jacked as you've ever felt before. You're ready to go for absolutely anything. But the Stormfather, who has the history locked in his own memory, his own existence.
The Stormfather knows that whoever he selects to become the new vessel cannot fight Odium, right? That's always been the thing, the part of the agreement, the thing that Honor and Tanavast have been trying for. Don't fight him because that will destroy everything. So the Stormfather has this very much at the forefront of his mind. And between the Stormfather and little Gavinor, I guess not little, but young Gavinor crying at the top of Urithiru, Dalinar is sort of brought back to himself. And he realizes in that moment that the visions that he has been having since Way of Kings about this epic cataclysm are actually of him. Like the vision that he is having is a potential future where he, as Honor, fights Odium and destroys everything like on Ashen.
Exactly. Specifically, the vision where the wind blades above Kholinar break down and like fall onto the city, which obviously couldn't have happened in the past because the wind blades are standing right now. And so that vision, as well as all of the other ones involving planetary destruction, are visions of him, or the potential him that would fight or choose to fight Odium in this moment. Which he does not, because he experiences and remembers moments of his life when he acted out of passion, like when he was beating Elhokar, moments of retribution when he's burning the rift out of anger and hatred, moments even of honor, the quote-unquote bad version of honor, when he is fighting the Parshendi for years and years, and then also the good moments of honor when he starts to refuse to fight those same Parshendi.
Yeah, so I thought this was really interesting when I went back into this to take notes for this episode. He has these 3 memories where he looks back on the person he used to be. And it's not explicitly stated that he is assigning these emotions to these memories. That was my interpretation. I thought it was interesting that he remembers being passionate, he remembers seeking retribution, and then he also remembers this kind of false version of honor. And those are the things that compel him, that convince him that in this moment, fighting is not the right thing. He's all of a sudden like, wait, I don't want to be any of those people that I just remembered. I don't want to be that version of myself, which means that I can't fight. That's not the answer here. And then he gets sucked into another final vision.
Right. I think the final vision, and one of the most confusing. We are going to talk a lot more about the specific character in this final vision because he experiences this vision where he meets Nohadon, we think.
Yeah, I mean, just who is Nohadon? Who is I have so many questions about this Nohadon-ish character. I also don't fully understand how Dalinar now, as a shard, is being pulled into a vision that is
what
like
is pulling
supposedly
him?
Coming from him?
Exactly. Is it Honor's vision like the other ones were? They were kind of like little recordings set up for someone to watch.
Right.
So is that the same thing? Is the power of Honor showing Dalinar something it always had ready to go?
Is he like not fully ascended in this moment or something? And so it's the power showing him as a human? I don't know. But those are questions that we'll get into in a future episode. For right now, we're just going to talk about what actually happens in this vision. Quote, Dalinar appeared somewhere warm, with light coming in through windows that was somehow softer than other light, more blurry, like he saw it through eyes that couldn't focus. He could see the room around him better, though. It was an antiquated stone chamber, full of the belongings gathered in a long life well lived. End quote.
So already this description of light is confusing and is like throwing up warning signals to me.
It's very similar to Dalinar's weird vision that is specifically not from the Stormfather that happens, I believe, at the end of Words of Radiance when they like get to the tower and he goes into, I think, his chamber for the first time. And then all of a sudden he has this vision of his childhood, I believe it is. And it's warm and sunny. And then he comes out of it and he's like, Stormfather, that was weird. Why did you give me that vision? And the Stormfather's like, I didn't, bro. I don't know what you're talking about. It's described in very similar terms, which makes me think that it's the same place. And I don't know if that place is the spiritual realm. The cognitive realm is generally described as being cold and or causing frost. And then is the spiritual realm like the warm one, or is this perhaps even the beyond? which
Right.
is neither one of those things.
Exactly. And then, of course, the question of like, how could he get to the beyond and return? That was something that we'd always been led to believe was like the end of the line that nothing comes back to from.
Well, I don't think he's like...
He's not there.
Yeah, he's not there, but it does raise the question of if Adonalsium, and therefore the shards, are capital G God, or if there is another divine power beyond the shards that is in the beyond, because we know that the shards exist in the cognitive realm and in the spiritual realm, but the beyond is something else.
Exactly. And this is the rabbit hole that we're going to kind of purposefully avoid going down for this episode, but definitely send us your theories on this moment, this vision, what it means, Nohadon, the little child power of honor, like hit us with all of those theories.
And Dalinar agrees with us because he shows up and he's like, what the heck? I'm like God now. Aren't I the one making visions? How come I'm here?
And we hear this, quote, Nohadon, Dalinar said, his hands on the tabletop. I don't have time for flighty visions of meaningless days. I'm standing right now at the nexus of all things, the final confrontation between odium and honor.
I would counter, Nohadon said, that this is the most important time for you to be reminded of lazy days baking bread. Why do you fight if not for days like these? End quote.
Dope retort from
Beautiful.
Nohadon.
Yeah.
He gives him a bread that's said to be
shin bread,
sweeter, right? With a little bit of salted butter.
Fluffier, yeah, with salted butter.
I know.
Great choice, Nohadon.
We're just getting hungry now.
I know. I'm like, I want warm bread with salted butter.
The moment of peak discussion or peak debate is regarding Gavinor and like what to do in this moment. We have, quote, you can't be encouraging me to kill Gav. Dalinar slammed his fist to the table. Nohadon wouldn't kill a child to achieve his goals.
Dalinar, Nohadon said, I did so all the time. Every policy I made hurt someone. End quote.
This is, to me, a little bit Taravangian-esque, who's saying, like, every decision that a leader makes is going to hurt someone, is going to cause some pain to some group. It's very utilitarian in that regard.
I don't think it's utilitarian. I think it's just true. I think that this is so relatable. There are so many times in so many of our lives when we have to make choices and neither one feels really good. I know I feel like this all the time where it's like, there's not actually an answer that I like, but I have to pick something.
Of course.
Not even like there's no perfect answer. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there is. Sometimes you can find a solution that feels really good and seems like it ticks all the boxes and you're like, I did it. I figured it out. I solved the problem and I came up with an answer that I am happy with. And sometimes it's not that way. Sometimes you do just have two bad choices and that's life.
Nohadon is going to have the capability to snap Dalinar back to both the first and last vision that he experienced. This is where Dalinar gets the recognition that the cataclysm is of his own making. The Stormfather is still with Dalinar in this otherworldly vision and is at least wondering if Tanavas was avoiding the very thing or the very decision that needed to be made.
Yeah, he is kind of like, oh, maybe you did just need to fight Odium. Maybe that's the answer. And Tanavast was just avoiding the hard thing that actually needed to be done. But Dalinar pushes back on that. He's like, no, I don't think that's true. I do think it's correct that I should not be in a direct clash with Odium. And Nohadon says, quote, a conundrum. But I suppose you are here at this decision point and not someone else. So maybe only you can know, end quote.
Dalinar, as I think maybe some of the readers, are definitely frustrated with this back and forth because there's not a clear answer. There's no solution.
Yeah, there's no good answer.
And I think that this is where the genius, as Hoyd will eventually label it, of Dalinar's decision starts to make itself clear, because any idiot can make a simple decision, just like do the right thing, don't kill a small child. That's a very easy decision that anybody should be able to make.
I mean,
it's when
it's hard. considered in this circumstance.
In
I
this
don't think
circumstance,
you can call that
that's
an easy decision.
no. I'm saying in a normal circumstance, in a different circumstance.
got
She's
it,
like,
got
don't
it.
go around
Yeah,
killing small children or kicking
Right.
dogs. Like,
but in this case,
yes.
even choosing not to kill Gav is an answer that will serve Odium in a different way.
Exactly. Because as we talked about in a previous episode, a major issue that Tanavas realize is that regardless of who is holding the power of Odium, whether it's Rasa or Ba-Ado-Mishram or eventually Taravangian, it doesn't matter because the power of Odium will always want the conflict and want the
power
war.
of honor.
And the power of honor, exactly. And so we have this, quote, "Who could stop the war? The powers," Dalinar whispered. "The war will stop when the powers themselves want it to stop." End quote. We are not at that point in the story right now.
Right.
The powers don't want the war to stop. And so somehow Dalinar needs to convince the powers of creation and godhood and all that ever was to do something different and to behave different, to believe something different, because if they don't, then they're always going to want the war to continue. So how do you make something that large and that amorphous change its mind?
And it's at this point that an anthropomorphic version of honor knocks on Nohadon's door. It's described as, quote, "an Alethi child, perhaps 9 or 10, of indistinguishable gender," end quote. And this is a representation of the power of honor that Dalinar is able to interact with. And he describes it, quote, "Honor in the power's eyes was about oaths, but there was a darker side to it. How many men had stabbed someone they loved because of honor? How many wars had been started because of an insult to honor? How much anger in the world had been caused by a belief in honor? The power accepted those definitions of it. It was the power of oaths and the pride that men bore at being thought of as men of oaths," end quote.
A devastating realization that I think you and I have talked quite a bit about, but importantly, it's the exact realization that Adolin so clearly vocalizes in Wind and Truth.
Yes.
Adolin is realizing this before Dalinar does.
MVP Adolin.
Of course, he is the best boy, but he understands something that Dalinar realizes in this moment.
Yes. Dalinar also realizes that one of the sort of foundational aspects of the power of honor is that it deeply, deeply cares about being right. And I think anyone who's been in a close relationship with anyone, whether it's family or friends or a romantic partner, knows that you can't really get anywhere if you're always trying to be right. You have to come at things with trying to understand, which is what Dalinar is doing and what the power has not yet learned how to do.
Exactly. The power has not yet learned it. And I'm reminded of a lovely scene from Stranger Things on the definition of compromise, which of course is to be halfway happy.
Halfway happy.
If you're only concerned about being right, then you're only concerned about being 100% happy at all times. But to exist with another person requires sharing, requires compromise.
Yeah, and requires to be able to see out of your own perspective, which is what honor is incapable of at this moment. It can only see its own very narrow definition of what honor is, and it's not able to be persuaded at this point, as Tanavast had tried to do and as Dalinar tries to do, that their actions can be right, can be good, because they are sort of outside of honor's very strict definition of honor. And even, I believe it's the Stormfather that this quote comes from, quote, "I fear the power, Dalinar, more than Taravangian. I fear honor as well. These powers were not meant to be held in isolation. Each of them is warped or distorted without the others," end quote. So to your point that we've talked about, we've kind of beat this to death at this point, but both the power of odium and the power of honor are these dangerous shards because they have been isolated from what was once a whole in Adonalsium.
we will definitely be returning to this scene for lore definitions and like a clear understanding of the powers across the Cosmere. But it's also unique because of the isolation that the power of honor has experienced. It has grown more self-aware, but in a kind of like twisted version where it's not truly learning anything new. It's not growing as a person and changing, like, for example, Myelarin and the other Spren. They are not remaining the same. They are choosing to be different, to act different.
Do you think that Maya is able to change in a different way because of her kind of bond with Adolin?
I think she will be able to, and she was able to in the past. And that's the strength of the Radiant Bond, is that it allows Spren, which otherwise would be very locked in their ways.
Yeah, because I think the answer is to be in relationship. I do think that the power of honor is changing in that it is growing in ways that other shard powers that have vessels, right, are not. I think maybe if you looked at the shard power of other shards, it would anthropomorphize as a baby, maybe, without the same kind of more advanced consciousness of a 9 or 10-year-old. But a 9 or 10-year-old, and this particular 9 or 10-year-old has kind of been traumatized.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
Like pretty strongly traumatized and then left alone. So any 10-year-old traumatized child just left alone is not necessarily going to be growing in a lot of productive ways. It's going to take that child being connected in relationship with something else and kind of brought back into the world and shown a different type of thing in order for it to start to grow and change in the way that you're speaking about.
Exactly. And I think that metaphor is important and probably apt to the other powers. Like, yes, they are infinite power, but they are babies or infants. And this thing that we are witnessing now is perhaps the most dangerous age of a human's life when they're about, 8 to 10, because they have enough sentience, they have enough intelligence to be truly dangerous. Like a baby, even an all-powerful baby, is just a baby and is still so reliant on the vessel in that case.
Yeah, there's a way in which the intent isn't really there. I'm also thinking maybe the other shard powers are like a full-grown dog or, an animal of some kind where they have an intelligence, but it's more instinctual than anything else. And, if a dog bites or attacks in a way, a lot of times you can't really hold it against the dog. They're behaving the way a dog should when threatened, etc. I think that's a little bit maybe like what the current shard powers are, where they're acting on instinct, but they're not necessarily premeditating, understanding, having any kind of intent behind their actions, which is something that's starting to change with this power of honor.
Right. An 8 or 9-year-old can build a trap for the purpose of hurting another human incredibly badly and find the whole thing funny. That is generally not what happens with adults. Like, you might be motivated by revenge or, hatred, blah, 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 blah. But an 8 or 9-year-old can do something very destructive and think the whole thing is hilarious. And that it's all just like a silly, like, I am God and I can do whatever I want and there are no repercussions.
Yeah,
and that's
the empathy hasn't completely sunk in yet.
Exactly. They have just enough intelligence to be incredibly dangerous. And that's the point that I think this little version of the power of honor is at right now, which is why it's frustrated with Dalinar and the contradictions that it sees within Dalinar's life. It knows everything about Dalinar. It knows what it experienced during the spiritual realm journey of Wind and Truth, and it especially confused about the burning of the rift, where Dalinar changed what happened in history. So I'm talking about the spiritual realm version.
In the spiritual realm.
Exactly.
Right.
Now that's also the birth of the Blackthorn, and we will definitely talk about that little cognitive shadow on another day. But the power of honor doesn't understand why Dalinar didn't follow the rules of the play or like the lines
He's
of
like,
the script.
why did you change it? Why didn't you follow through with doing what was right, which was to burn the rift? Like, they did something bad. You were right to attack them.
And Dalinar says this to the power of honor. Quote, "Can you try? You want to be understood. Do you not think others want to be understood too by you?" End quote. In my mind, this little kernel of a suggestion, this little bit that Dalinar incepts into the power of honor is going to become the downfall of retribution. Like, this to me is the seed that grows into a more cognizant honor, a teenage or an adult honor that is able to make different decisions. And this is the genius moment that maybe Hoy doesn't even fully understand at this point, because he doesn't call out this moment. Why would he know necessarily about this
of course,
spiritual realm thing? He calls out the genius related to attracting all of the other shards. But I think the actual genius is this moment, that Dalinar is able to understand and with enough empathy make a connection with the power of honor that will change it.
Yeah, that he's able to plant this seed, and then also that he has the faith, the trust, the lack of ego to step away and like let that seed grow how it will grow. In this conversation, Dalinar comes to the conclusion that he does believe that honor can change over time. He says, quote, "The powers must be able to change. Everyone can change, even me. I walked those paths. I saw the past. I know divinity. Honor must learn. That's the answer," end quote. He steps away from sort of needing to be right in a way, of needing to be the hero, of needing to be the guy who does it all, who ascends, who is the man on high. He does what he can, which is pretty small, not seen by anyone. I think at some point Renarin even remarks that it is sad that his dad is always going to be remembered as the hero who failed.
Right.
Yeah. And yet Dalinar sacrifices that ego, that dream, that story in favor of something that he hopes, and again has faith, will change things for his descendants.
Absolutely. And so often throughout Wind and Truth, we hear about that version of Dalinar, the one who is willing to beat down Elhokar and to take power and be like, by the way, I'm also going to be sleeping with your mom, and to be the ego that needs to always be in charge. I'm going to form the coalition and I'll hold it together.
Even when trying to be a better person,
Yes.
right? Like, even when he starts down the path of self-improvement, there's still a little bit of ego in that, in the, I'm better now. I'm being the better man. I'm beating up Elhokar because it's in service of better ideals. He's not listening to the fact that, we should be trying to end this war, etc. Even that version of him is a little bit wrapped up in the ego, in the story of who he is.
And so it may be the most impressive bit of character development, and certainly a great example of subverting normal stories in a fantasy world.
Yes.
Because the answer, the solution, is to step back.
Yeah, the answer is that I can't be the hero.
It's so reminiscent to me of Tress of the Emerald Sea, and what Hoyd calls out may be a Hoyd who has already experienced this moment, because we think that happens in the future, and he's telling the story, but he's remarking on Tress and saying she does this amazing thing. She takes a moment to sit and think.
She just considers things very thoughtfully.
Which is what Dalinar is doing in this moment.
Yeah.
And we don't know how much of this moment Hoyd is aware of, but I think that we as readers know that Brandon is trying to communicate that as a valuable thing, where for so much of your and my personal lives, but also the lives of most readers, the media the movies and television shows and books that we've read, they're always about the hero taking action. You have this Joseph Campbell like call to adventure.
Yes.
And Luke Skywalker needs to go out into the world and he's going to be the hero of ages and all that jazz.
Sometimes you can be a hero by doing nothing. Or by doing something very small, doing something, just in your own family or your own community, something that maybe no one is really going to notice, but will make the world better.
Right. And in Dalinar's circumstance, nobody will notice.
Yeah.
And they will actually have the opposite opinion about him going forward.
It'll look bad.
It's going to look bad
it's look bad in the short term.
Yeah. And that's what is called out by, I think it's Bright Lord Royan, who says like, yeah, but we lost. Like at the end of the day, he went up there and we lost. And this is all for naught, basically. And like, we are the losers now.
Yeah.
And that's how.
It was like, good try, but it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And that's the question. How much does it matter? Because this gambit of Dalinar's is incredibly risky. It's incredibly bold to not take an aggressive action when you have all power.
Yes. We actually haven't even gotten to that decision yet, though. So Honor and Dalinar have a conversation. Dalinar sort of plants this seed and lets Honor sit on its own and think about what has been said. And then he has another conversation with Nohadon where Nohadon sort of coaches Dalinar to define what it is that he actually is trying to get out of the situation, to be really specific about what he wants to accomplish. Dalinar is having a hard time making a decision. It looks like all of his choices are bad choices, but the way that he can make a decision, the way that he can choose from those bad options is to figure out exactly what he wants. And then once he does that, quote, now that he knew the end he wanted, Dalinar could see the answers. You never could find them unless you knew what you were looking for, could you? End quote. And this was when he realizes that he needs to buy time. Time for Honor to learn and grow. Time for that seed to turn into something. And he also needs to deny Odium time to scheme and get stronger or more capable. Taravangian is a new vessel, and so more time actually empowers him and gives him time to sort of get his feet under him.
I am very intrigued in this moment, especially because as the power of a god, we know that each of the shards has future sight, some to a better degree than others. But Dalinar says that he could see the answers only when he knew what he was looking for. And we've seen it also described as like this field of infinite possibilities where, anything could happen and it's very difficult to understand what will happen, what specific tone will actually snap into reality. And Dalinar is giving us the concept that what you need to have is the choices you will make defined, and that will help you find the answers going forward.
Yeah, it's a little bit, journey and destination. You do need to have a destination in mind.
Yes.
You don't want to just be wandering randomly. The journey is important and maybe is the thing that you should be focused on, but you do need to be like going somewhere.
Definitely. It's journey before destination.
Right, exactly. Not that the destination doesn't matter at all.
Exactly. Not journey, not destination, but that the destination is important, it is significant, and the journey is that practice that will allow you to build up the person that you want to be.
So you can get where you're trying to go.
Exactly, but you have to know where you want to end up and where you want to go. You can't just be aimlessly walking through the forest. You'll never get there.
And it's impossible to make a choice, right? If you have a fork in the road and you don't know where you're trying to get, how are you going to choose whether to go right or left?
Now, when a bunch of stuff happens in what I'm guessing is like seconds of actual time,
yes,
Dalinar does say this, quote, Kaladin will preserve a peace. That's what we need. End quote. Talking about honor.
That quote is not explained in any way, shape, or form.
Just
There's
a line.
No context at all. So I don't know what that means, but I do think it's important for us to remember it. And maybe we'll come back to this when we talk about the new Oath Pact.
Definitely. I think that's where we'll discuss it a little bit more. But fans, feel free to reach out and let us know what you think Kaladin's piece that he needs to preserve is, or what it could be. And then we will put that into an episode in the future when we discuss the new Oath Pact.
And the conclusion that Dalinar comes to is that he must renounce his oaths. Quote, Dalinar felt the Stormfather there, and he remarkably came to the same conclusion. The path of the heralds from long ago, a path Dalinar had spent a lifetime trying to understand. End quote.
This decision is the opposite of what we basically all expected or were thinking would happen. We were trying to understand a way that Dalinar would remain true, remain strong with his oaths, and that the whole point, right, what he says to Sabariel as he's walking up, he's like, I'm going to solve this with oaths and light.
Yeah.
And guess what we don't have anymore? The oaths of Dalinar or Stormlight on Rashar.
Yeah, it's such, again, a subversion of expectation, of trope. Kind of the entire series has been emphasizing the importance of maintaining oaths, the importance of doing what you've committed to do. And in this moment, the right thing to do is actually to kind of let yourself off the hook. Dalinar allowing himself to step away from his oaths, to step away from what he said he would do, because given new information,
exactly,
this is actually the right path.
So much of Rhythm of War and Wind and Truth was about this transition from the vessel Rasa to the vessel Teravangian, and then realizing that, like, we had made an agreement with one thing and now we're dealing with another thing, and they are not the same.
Yeah.
They are different. They represent something different. The rules have changed.
Things have changed. Either external circumstances like that, or you yourself have changed. You've been given new information. Your perspective has changed. Your mind has changed. And there is honor in acknowledging when you can't succeed, in acknowledging when there's no sense in continuing to sort of batter the wall, right? Of like, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Sometimes the best thing to do is just say, you know what? I can't win. I can't win this conflict. I'm up against a vessel that I wasn't expecting to be up against. Mm-hmm. I'm up against a conflict that I, as a human mortal, was not prepared for. And correct, there is no good answer.
It's the exact opposite of what the heralds experienced in their own life. They were never able to walk away from the fight. They
did at Ahariadium.
They did at Ahariadium.
Yeah.
And they did so by making Taln hold up the entirety of their agreement. But they should have all walked away from the agreement. That's what Dalinar is doing here. Obviously, he's one person, not 10 people, but they don't actually break the Oath Pact fully. They try to worm their way out of it instead of saying, no, the whole thing is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this.
They do try to do that. I think that this quote that we just read is comparing Dalinar to the heralds, though, in that way, that he is like, I didn't understand why they walked away. And now he does understand why they walked away. Like, I think they are equivalent.
I feel like they went with the half measure because honor was unable or unwilling to let them fully, and because they have so much honor within them, they're so empowered by honor.
Yeah.
I don't think they were able to make the same decision that Dalinar was.
So you disagree with the quote, or Dalinar's
the interpretation?
Perspective.
No, it's not Dalinar's perspective. I think it's your interpretation of the quote specifically.
He says the path of the heralds from long ago, a path that Dalinar had spent a lifetime trying to understand.
Absolutely.
But they're coming to the same conclusion.
It's their path that they were on, but they did not have the skills or the background. They did not allow themselves to make the actual hard decision, which is not abandon your friend Taln to hold up the agreement. It is to make a change so drastic that it would break the Oath Pact entirely and to kind of destroy anything that they were working on. That would be the version of fully renouncing their oaths. They halfway renounce their oaths because they knew they had Taln who would keep his oath. That to me is not the same thing. Nobody has oaths anymore after what Dalinar does. That's the difference and the kind of like distinct aspect that I believe Dalinar is like superior in making.
I mean,
in this
I think
moment.
there are still oaths after this.
Certainly, like people are able to make, but Dalinar fully breaks from his oaths 100%.
Yes, that's correct.
The oath pact in that instance of 10 people is 9/10 broken, right? It's like not fully committing to the break. They're like, how can we walk away and break our oaths and our agreements? But it's not all of them unified in a decision. Dalinar, as one person, makes a unified decision within himself and then has the full ramifications of that here. Quote, I renounce my oaths, Dalinar said. I break our contract. I break the oaths and contracts that Honor has made with Odium, all of them. I will not make any of the choices presented to me. I release you. I break my oaths. End quote. That full-throated renunciation of his oaths, Honor's oaths, and the releasing of Odium is shocking. Like, I wasn't prepared for anything like this. I thought he was going to, maybe closer to the Heralds, find a way to worm out of it. Like, maybe there's going to be a loss, but there will still be something. No. He just says, the game is stupid. I'm done with it. I renounce everything. Mm-hmm. Of course, this destroys his brand new relationship with Honor that we just were discussing so much.
Yeah, little baby Honor is pretty upset because it had a hard time trusting Dalinar to begin with. And then Dalinar immediately kind of traumatizes it again. But Dalinar has a lot to say about this. To the Shard of Honor, he says, quote, for you are not Honor, not yet. Honor is far more than an oath kept, end quote. And
devastating. Devastating. Oh my gosh. You take the power of Honor and you go like, you ain't Honor. Not yet. That's just an immortal. Like he's been alive, what, 50, 60 years? And he's just like, you, infinite power?
Oh, yeah.
Nah, you dumb. You a dumb little kid. Oh, it's so devastating. I'm sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
It's okay. He then tells Taravangian, quote, keeping an oath is not an ultimate good, Taravangian, Dalinar whispered. It is only as good as the ideals it is sworn to. Uniting is not an ultimate good. It is only as good as the purposes for that unification. I have been bested by you. Continuing in this contract merely because I agreed to it. That would be the ultimate act of foolishness. You have won because you are smarter than I am, but you have not proven anything other than that, end quote. And so this idea that persistence is not always a virtue. This reminds me of, there's a moment in The Good Place when Chidi is talking about a particular branch of moral philosophy, and he says that he wasn't present for surgery. Like his mom went into surgery and he couldn't be there because he'd already told his friend's nephew that he would like help them set up their iPhone or something. Like this idea that always keeping your word and like doing exactly what you said you were going to do is not always the right thing to do.
Of course, the stakes are a tiny bit higher than when Chidi didn't go to his mom's surgery. Still devastating on a personal note. However, because this is the violation of the power of Honor and Dalinar's agreement, the one they just made to become merged, because it is the renouncing of all binding principles against Odium, Dalinar is setting up so much potential destruction, so much potential devastation. It would seem, again, nothing that we could prepare ourselves for in this, what is going to become the birth of Retribution.
Yeah, up until this point, we're all still thinking like Hoyd, where he's like, look, one thing we need to make sure at all costs is that Odium stays trapped in the Rasharan system. That is the gold standard, the ultimate goal. And that's exactly the opposite of what Dalinar does. He changes things on a cosmic scale like they haven't been changed in 4,000 years.
I mean,
more?
Arguably all the way back to the shattering of Adenalsium. Like,
well, I'm just thinking since Odium and Honor and Cultivation make the first pact where they're like, we will remain trapped in the Rasharan system.
Certainly.
Since that moment, this is the first time that Odium has had any latitude to move throughout the Cosmere, which is what changes everything for the other shards.
And the first thing that Odium does when he is unbound by these chains is vaporize the Stormfather. Just waves his hand and the Stormfather is obliterated from existence.
Yep.
Now there are a whole bunch of questions that can come up in regards to what does that mean for honor, for the people of Roshar, for the biology of the planet that relies upon storms and Krem. And we're going to talk about all of that type of stuff in the future. But it's of note that the moment Odium is given freedom, the thing he does is destroy the Stormfather.
Which is, as you said, the last remnant of Tanavast.
Definitely. Now, Dalinar is able to communicate to the power of honor, which has not yet been taken up. That's going to come in just a second. But Dalinar says, quote, go, watch, learn, end quote.
Right, because Odium vaporizes the Stormfather, and then Taravangian reaches for the power of honor. And Dalinar is watching this. This, to me, is the very last moment that there can be any doubt that Taravangian is only interested in power for himself. And this is what Dalinar sees. He's sort of thinking in the back of his mind, you know, Taravangian, you always said it wasn't about the power for you. You always said you were just trying to do what was right. This is the moment when we're really going to see if that's true. Because if it's not about the power, you're not going to grab for honor. And yet he does. And so every last doubt is vaporized in this moment as well. The power of honor kind of hesitates as Taravangian is reaching for it. And that's when Dalinar is like, nope, go have an experience, go learn things, kind of sends the little power off to boarding school.
And while the power does join with Taravangian, it is not before we hear this, quote, a few small pieces of it split off and fled. Dalinar had not expected that, end quote.
So these pieces are different than whatever piece Kaladin is going to preserve, because Dalinar does expect that.
Oh, that's actually very interesting, because there are a few. And so I was, okay, so here, let's talk this out, because you've interrupted what was my big theory.
Yeah.
I thought that one of these small pieces was going to Kaladin. And maybe that's still true. But what you're saying is Dalinar expected Kaladin to preserve honor, but he didn't expect these small pieces to break off.
Right, because we have that previous quote where he anticipates it. He sort of sees into the future and he's like, Kaladin's going to preserve a piece. I can rely on that. And then this happens where a few small pieces split off and Dalinar is like, oh, weird. Didn't see that coming. So these are obviously two different things.
Okay, I'm not 100% convinced, but that's a very good point, because what Dalinar could have been thinking about in regards to Kaladin is that within Kaladin, there is already a piece of honor.
Sure.
The son of Tanavast, he's going to hold strong. He'll be the guide to how to be honorable, and he doesn't need anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have this moment when small pieces break off from the power of honor, and I still think one of those pieces goes to Kaladin.
Oh, I think that's possible, but either way, they're not the same thing.
They are not the same thing.
Yeah.
You're right. I think Dalinar saw something or sees something within Kaladin that makes him believe Kaladin, without any extra stuff, can hold or preserve the power of honor. And then he gets, in my opinion, one of these small pieces.
Do you think that it's his honor blade or his honor spear?
Yeah, that was my guess, because obviously that's a separate thing from Syl. And we know that the honor blades, as they were originally created, were like little slivers of honor. So yes.
That's what makes the most sense to me. But then why are there a few?
Because I don't think he's the only one who
He's not the only new herald?
Not the only one across Roshar who is capable of a piece of honor, a sliver of honor arriving for them. For example.
You think that there are other people on Roshar that suddenly get an honor blade?
Not necessarily an honor blade, but a piece of honor is attracted to a person. This could be a listener. This could be someone like Venli or someone within the group of Venli. This could be the Storm Wall, the person that we see in Wind and Truth as the highest ideal radiant outside of Kaladin, where there could just be like other people who are worthy. To bring it over to like the Marvel universe, the whole thing is like Thor is the only one who is worthy, but Captain America has a scene in the early Avengers where he like shifts Mjolnir. And I'm saying, even though Captain didn't wield the hammer until much later, he was always worthy of it. And I think there might be a bunch of other people, or a few at least, who are worthy of these pieces of honor. And Kaladin is just the most obvious one. He's the Thor in my example.
All right.
Complete speculation, and I'm making this up on the fly.
We only have speculation at this point.
Yeah, so hit me up if you have a different theory in regards to these small pieces of honor that have split off. And then what you call out, and I do think that's important, that Dalinar did not expect or anticipate breaking off.
And so Dalinar returns to his mortal form. There is a raging storm at the top of Urithiru, and Dalinar's final act in his entire life is to protect Gavinor from this storm. He's basically almost dead by that point, and he uses sort of his last few breaths to make his way across the top of Urithiru and drape his body over his grandson in order to save him from the storm.
Yeah, when his body is eventually found and Gavinor is found alive in his adult form, to be noted, it's said that his back is like shredded by rocks, and then he has a large wound on his head. So we are left to assume, that we don't exactly see it, that, you know, he was struck and killed in that storm. As Odium takes up the power of honor, those two distinct powers are now swirling together, being held by Taravangian, and a new shard is created, something we've only seen one other time in the Cosmere with the creation of Harmony on Scadrial. Now we have the birth of Retribution on Rashar. And with this birth comes an entirely new world.
Yes. It changes kind of everything about Rashar. Quote, he was more powerful than anything. Only one other came close, but those powers were misaligned. While Honor and Odium wanted nearly the same things, they would work together. Though something about his predecessor echoed to him from the past. Reza had never wanted this. He'd killed several other gods and refused their power. Was he a fool? He must have been, because this was glorious. End quote.
To me, this is the fatal mistake that Taravangian is making, not realizing that Reza, a being who is thousands of years older than he, might have been making a correct decision on the multiple times he killed gods and didn't take up their power.
Right.
He didn't reject it once.
Yeah.
He rejected it multiple times.
Yeah.
And then Taravangian's like, but it feels so good. And so I think this is setting up his eventual destruction, along with all of the stuff that we've talked about regarding Dalinar incepting little baby Honor.
Yeah, I do think that this is going to play a part in Retribution's eventual downfall. We hear that Reza didn't want to take up other shards because he didn't want the intent of Odium to change or be corrupted in any way. He wanted to remain with the same intent. I don't know that I completely fully understand his reasoning for that, but I guess we'll find out.
Yes, exactly. We're going to get a whole second half of the Stormlight Archive that demonstrates who was right, because I definitely think this is going to be on display. I can at least understand, because we've seen the difficulty that Harmony has had in Era 2 on Scadrial, and will, of course, be getting Mistborn Era 3 books prior to a return to Rashar. So we should see even more examples of what it's like to be Harmony.
But these are set up in obvious contrast, where we see the powers that Harmony is holding in direct opposition, and Honor and Odium are said to want basically the exact same things.
Yeah.
And so they're working together much more synchronously.
Definitely. And so it's more dangerous and it's worse.
Yeah.
But I think the word nearly is important. They don't want the same things. They want nearly the same things. But if the power of honor is able to change over time and grow and learn,
Yes.
then it might want something different.
To me, yeah, the biggest question here is what happens when a vessel is holding a shard that has its own baby sentience, more so than a typical shard. We already see so many instances of vessels and shards conflicting, where the shards do want something. They have some kind of instinct, some kind of primal desire that aligns with their intent, as we've discussed. And that can often contradict what the vessel is wanting. I think that is only going to be escalated when the shard power has more consciousness, more sentience outside of the vessel. That conflict is going to be even more pugnacious.
Definitely. I think you perfectly described it, and is everything that was built up through the story of Wind and Truth. The vessel versus power conflict was on display. We know with 100% certainty that this power specifically is more developed than all the other powers. Like, what happens when this becomes an angry teenager? We're about to find out. Like, it's going to enter its angry teen emo phase at the exact same time that Retribution wants to use it and abuse it and make it bow to its will. And you're going to get the teenage version of the power of honor that's just like, I don't want to do that, Dad. And
to be like, I have a different identity now. You still think that I'm the old version of honor, and I'm new. I dyed my hair blue, okay?
It is my favorite color.
I have a different definition of honor.
I like how teenage honor has just become a Valley Boy from California.
Yeah, obviously.
Obviously. He's from the OC, right? He's just
Yeah.
Welcome to Orange County. Now, importantly, while the birth of Retribution is a moment of incredible power and comes with incredible risk, it is also the thing that Hoid sees and recognizes as the genius of Dalinar's gambit.
Well, not just the creation of Retribution, but the fact that odium has been unleashed, I think, is even the bigger thing. Those two factors sort of stack on top of each other to make an ultra crisis for the Cosmere. But the more relevant thing is not just that Retribution has been created. I think even if Retribution was created and it was still trapped in the Rasharan system, the other shards would be like, ooh, bummer, but like, not my problem.
Which is what they had been saying for thousands of years.
Exactly.
It's
now
the
they
freedom.
have the double threat of odium being unchained, and now it's more powerful.
And so the birth of Retribution is also the true battle of the Cosmere's beginning.
Yeah.
We have this, quote, as of now, the other gods' attention fixated on Taravangian. Each of those vast beings witnessed the birth of the most powerful and dangerous thing that had existed since the shattering of Adonalsium. Jumping forward just a little bit, those forces together acknowledged that they had an enemy. Freed from his constraints, supremely strong, he was the biggest threat in the entire Cosmere. End quote. Hoid calls this out, of course, as the genius of Dalinar, that he forced the other shards to pay attention, that he forced the beginning, before other people were ready, of the true battle over the Cosmere. Now, I think we've already talked about, I think the true genius is giving Little Baby in Honor a growth potential, a seed potential, but this is definitely a big one, because everything that we know about what comes next in the Cosmere is going to be defined by this moment and by the recognition of other shards that they can no longer ignore Taravangian and Retribution.
Yes. As for Retribution's sort of internal life now at the beginning of its life, we have, quote, Retribution would keep his promises. Oaths were important. And Retribution would destroy anyone who believed differently. Strangely, the power of honor displayed the slightest hint of uncertainty. What was that? Why was it acting so oddly? Taravangian's expanded knowledge found this impossible. Was it because some of it had been siphoned off, locked away? End quote.
This is another potential avenue for one of those pieces of honor that it seems Retribution is saying was siphoned off and locked away.
Yeah, I don't know what locked away means.
Well, we know that Retribution planned to impact or even destroy the Spren, but he's unable to do so by the new Oath Pact. So one of the pieces of honor may have gone into the defense mechanism of the Spren, and kind of the force field or the power source for the force field around the Spren could be one of the pieces of honor. Like the tower has the little crystal where Navani is kind of like trapped and is also like the heart or the protected heart of the tower itself. There could be something like that for all of the Spren. A lot more speculation to come on all of these points, and I'm going to have half a decade to speculate further. So buckle up, folks.
And in this moment, with the rest of the shards suddenly turning their gazes on him, Retribution realizes that he doesn't have time to scheme and plan. He needs to act decisively, and his plan is to escape the planet before they're able to attack. He wants to direct their attention to a conflict happening on Scadrial. I think we can assume this is the conflict between Harmony and Autonomy, and we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what this means for the greater Cosmere in our next episode with a special guest.
There are a couple of huge, impactful events that kind of happen rapid fire towards the end of Wind and Truth. And each of them we could speculate a lot further on and kind of may eventually become their own episodes. This includes Dalinar going to the Beyond, but seemingly claimed by someone else. That's an interesting quote. The creation of the Blackthorn and how that could be used in the future. But what I want us to end this episode with is a look at the new Everstorm, what Retribution calls the true Everstorm.
Yeah, there's a few different physical effects that happen to the planet of Rashar as a result of the birth of Retribution. The High Storm is consumed by the Everstorm. It no longer exists. Quote, "The High Storm was consumed by the Everstorm at his will, creating a ripple through nature, one he reveled in, causing the passage of time to warp around this world." End quote. Now, the High Storm was imbued with the power of honor such that it kind of acted as a pseudo-perpendicularity for honor, and with all of that investiture inside of it, its destruction is what warps everything around Rashar.
And from years ago, there's a word of Brandon where he said that the high storms do precede the arrival of honor and cultivation on Rashar. And since we now have a pretty good date about Adonalsium creating Rashar, we can assume that the high storms have existed almost since the planet was made.
I think the storm as a physical entity is always there, and then it becomes invested by honor.
And then very recently, in a interview with our friends over at Shardcast, Brandon said, just to be as clear as possible, there is no more Stormlight on Rashar. Stormlight is evaporated when the Stormfather is killed and the Everstorm consumes the High Storm. But what I think is most reminding me of the descriptions from Cell is what this is doing to the spiritual realm, that fueled by Retribution's rage, there is a distortion happening in the spiritual realm around Rashar or of Rashar. And I think that's very similar to what happened when the shards of devotion and dominion were killed, the powers went into the cognitive realm and they began to warp everything there. But I don't think it's entirely or only cognitive. I think the bulk of their power remains in the cognitive realm, but there's also a warping that's happening in the spiritual realm there. It's very chaotic.
You might actually be thinking of Threnody, because I'm pretty sure it's specifically said that on Threnody, what has happened is a spiritual warping due to the conflict between odium and ambition in that system. So to me, that sounds more similar to what is happening on Rashar. And man, if you've read Shadows for Silence, scary.
Yeah, it does not have good...
Not great.
...impacts across the entire world. But we have multiple examples, and like we've just, called them out, of what happens when there is warping of a shard's power within the cognitive and the spiritual realms. What seems to be unique, or maybe at least most drastic around Rashar, is that this is also changing the passage of time. And this time dilation is essential to understanding the rest of how the Cosmere is going to play out.
I'm actually not sure if this is unique. Now that I'm thinking about Threnody, you and I were recently talking about space travel in the Cosmere and the Night Brigade and how exactly the Canticleites, the people who had fled from Threnody, got space travel. Now I'm wondering if perhaps the distortion around the Threnodite system maybe sped up time for them.
Very interesting.
So that they were able to achieve space travel faster than everyone else, but for them it felt like 500 years or whatever.
Yeah, I'm going to have to dive into Tyler's timey-wimey brain to try to lay these things out. Like, what would happen if you sped up Threnody versus slowed down time on Rashar? And like, could that explain how a group of people from Threnody are going to leave in a spaceship and arrive on Canticle, but we think all of that happens in the future from this moment. However, the death of ambition happened so long ago in the past for Rashar.
Yeah.
Like, what was going on in between those two things? It would be very interesting if the answer was Threnody was in some type of time bubble.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay. That's too much speculation.
Yeah, that's a whole other tangent.
But this is what happens when you start to introduce the concept of the warping of time. Let's get a little bit more detail from the text, and then we'll wrap all of this up. Quote, "The Everstorm blanketed the entire land, not as violent as it had been at times, true, but pervasive. It seemed that in expanding it to the entire continent, Odium had been forced to let it weaken. It was wind and rain, mostly with little lightning. At least the quaking of the ground had stilled for the most part, though the news they gathered of changes to the landscape terrified him." End quote. So we should now think of Rashar as a planet that is completely covered in storm, or at least the continent.
Except for Azamir.
So like a hole, an eye of the storm.
Yeah,
almost.
There's like a perfect hole around Azamir, which is the only place exempt from the deal that Odium won.
And we think that the Tower of Urithiru has its own like protective bubble of, wind and truth that protect it from this ever storm. But the high storm and the infused nature of that high storm existed for so long on Rashar that the entirety of the biology of the planet was based around its existence. The rocks are shaped in a certain way. The animals and the plant life reacts.
Grow
everything.
in certain areas.
And so we just have no idea how damaging this is going to be, how much the Everstorm can replace that. Is the Everstorm filled with void light? Or some type of warlight?
No, it's not. I have that as another effect, but let's just stick with the storms for the moment, because as you mentioned, the high storm and the fact that it was carrying stormlight was a huge defining feature for the physical landscape of Rashar, as well as all of the human and singer societies on Rashar. And to back up the quote from Brandon from 17th Shard, we also hear in the text, Shallan asks Kelsier about this. She says, quote, "No more Stormlight?" Shallan asked. "For how long?"
Forever, end quote.
No more Stormlight forever, which is kind of wild. And then we hear that in terms of Void Light, which is now the only light, or I guess War Light.
That's the thing. I'm still asking the question of like, is it Void Light? Is it War Light? But go ahead and explain the circumstance, because there is still a way for the people of Rashar to get light. I just don't know what type it is.
Yes, they can get light. I'm pretty sure it's War Light. I don't think he's able to make Void Light anymore because he's Retribution. But they have to like supplicate themselves to Odium. It's such a creepy, controlling, abusive boyfriend maneuver. Quote, "All would wither unless they used his light to grow and thrive. They would have to rely on him for everything." End quote.
You were throwing a lot of spice on that quote, and I like it. I think that this concept is extended out because at a certain time, at midnight every day, they can place spheres beneath an open sky and ask him to bless them. Of course, they also need the light to exist.
Yeah, gross.
It's absolutely gross, but it's very Retribution. It is, to me, villainous. It's true evil.
Yeah.
And that's why there's no question for me regarding the meta question of like, who's the villain of the Cosmere? It's Retribution. That's the answer.
Yeah.
And
like Honor was sometimes a bad dad, but abusive boyfriend is worse.
Do you want to hit me with some rapid fire ideas on the time dilation as well as some other effects going on the planet, and then we'll call it?
Yeah, I think let's hit some quick quotes about the time dilation, because this is going to be a huge talking point, I think, for the entire fandom over the next several years in our attempts to understand what's happening in the greater Cosmere and how this is impacting the way that everything is connecting and aligning together. So I think this will be really helpful for a lot of people. At one point, Thydakar comments that the near destruction of the world because of the two clashing shards, followed by two shards merging into one, has, as we said earlier, kind of warped the spiritual realm around the planet, and that warping is changing the way that time flows. We see when our characters are in the spiritual realm that time flows differently in the spiritual realm, and so we have very clear examples of that spiritual environment, spiritual power impacting the flow of time, and that is extended and expanded to the entire physical system because of this cataclysm. And then in terms of exactly how time is aligning for Rashar versus the rest of the Cosmere, Thydakar says, quote, "You think we're communicating directly, but the better part of an hour passes here between each of your replies to me. You think that it has been a few months, but it has been years for us." End quote.
Yeah, going on to say that the time dilation is slowing around Rashar. So the actual effect is slowing, and the worst was at the beginning, but it still is going to continue for a length of time that is unknown. Thydakar estimates maybe 70 or 80 years from now, you'll realign with Cosmere standard, but that may seem like a decade or so for you. This is incredibly important when you are trying to put the different stories and the different books together. To very briefly go over it, but we will of course be talking about this timeline so much more. We know for a fact that Hoid leaves Rashar, he's killed, and then appears on Scadrial at the beginning of Alloy of Law, at the beginning of Era 2.
Yeah.
All of Era 2 needs to occur, which is 8 years or so.
Yeah, it's like 7 or 8 years.
Because Wax has an 8-year-old child by the end of book 4. Then there is a jump in time until we get to Era 3. We don't have the exact number, but we think that's like 50 to 60 years of a jump in time. And so we should imagine that all of Mistborn Era 3 will be completed for people on Scadrial by the time that Rashar realigns with Cosmere Standard Time.
Yeah, I think that's pretty likely.
Now, the impacts for characters is something that we are definitely going to discuss a whole bunch more. For example, Shallan is trapped in the cognitive realm away from her husband, her friends, and quote unquote, definitely hashtag all spoilers all the time. We think with child, and having a child within this time bubble, what does that do? Are you messed up in some way by spending a long period of time within a warped non-Cosmere standard bubble? And is that going to impact all of our characters? I have no idea, but I love the example that comes from the Avatar: The Last Airbender universe, where little baby Aang is locked before the events start of the series. He's locked away for 100 years in his little icicle ball. He experiences a whole life and dies before the events of Korra, which, if you only looked at his age, is incredibly young for avatars. Because they're so spiritual, they normally live significantly longer lives than regular people in the Avatar world. But what the mythology of the Avatar verse states is that Aang was impacted so strongly by the powerful bending and the long period of time that he spent frozen away that he didn't get to actually live 100 or 150 years.
Well, it's more like the 100 years that he was hidden counted.
Basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was like you thought it didn't count, but it definitely did count.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if a similar thing is going to happen to our characters. Are they going to have unnaturally short or unnaturally long lifespans because they're living within this bubble? We've never seen anything like that, because for a character like Wayne, who has bend alloy, the rate that he burns bend alloy at means that he does not have the ability to stay within a bubble for more than a couple of minutes at a time.
Yeah.
Where functionally, all of these people are going to be within a time bubble for the next decade minimum. And so, like, what does that do to your spiritual realm? I have no idea.
Although this is more like Marasi's bubbles. And
slow bubble.
Marasi is able to make her bubbles bigger than Wayne's, and she's also able to maintain them for longer. So there is kind of a comparable thing that we know. But there are a lot of other effects on the planet of Rashar as well, including a change to Odium's perpendicularity. Venli goes back and looks at it, and it had emptied out, and then it starts to refill with a new liquid that's described as a brilliant black blue, and it has a new tone that pulses to the rhythm of war.
We speculated a little bit last time about the shard pool of Odium, and now what does it mean that the shard pool of Retribution is in the one land that is not controlled by Retribution?
Well, he also doesn't control Asmere.
Well, sorry,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
the
yeah.
one land, but
there's a couple.
Yes,
but
you would expect the shard to have control over the pool, but he very clearly does not, because it is the listeners who now control the Shattered Plains.
yes. And then, of course, as you alluded to earlier, the sibling and Navani are still around. She is the last remaining bondsmith. And when this whole thing happens, when Dalinar makes his gambit, the sibling is able to sense what's going on. And they say to Navani, quote, it's brilliant and terrible. The enemy holds both shards and becomes retribution. Cultivation flees. Navani, we are in serious danger. This could destroy me.
Grieve later. Storms. Could she grieve later? What do we do? Navani said.
We have to keep Retribution out of Urithiru, the sibling said. He's going to destroy the Spren, but not us here if we can create defenses. It will be your will and mine against his. I don't know if... Oh, shards, Navani, he's coming.
Do it, Navani said. End quote.
And that's all the information we get about exactly what the sibling and Navani are able to do. We know that this results in a force field around the entirety of Urithiru that is described as being as solid as crystal and is completely impassable. It keeps people out of Urithiru, but it's also keeping everyone who's there at the time inside. And then Navani is trapped in another bubble inside of
She's
Urithiru.
Now little baby Aang.
Yeah, basically.
Stuck inside of her ice bubble, except it is a green-blue light that fills the entire room, some type of crystal, and Navani is floating in the center, just like Aang, glowing, frozen with her eyes closed.
Yeah,
alive.
In some type of stasis.
Exactly. We don't know what that means, and it's just up to all of us to speculate. But the tower is still fully functioning with tower light available to Radiance.
So no stormlight, but if you're at Urithiru and you're a Radiant, you can still access tower light to power your abilities while you're there. You can't leave anyway, so...
Yeah. So if you happen to be a Radiant in training at the Tower of Urithiru, you have a bunch of light to practice with. And I think that might come in handy for one of our other big characters that we're going to talk about another day.
And then, of course, the effect on the Spren. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our episode about the new Oath Pact, which will go into more detail about exactly what is going on with the Spren now that Mishram has been released and we have Retribution. But we do hear this, quote, "As he tried to draw the Spren toward him, the power refused to absorb them. They are protected," his powers said. "By what?" Retribution demanded. "By an oath and a circle," the powers said. "By Adonalsium's strength. 10 stand against you, using the piece of us within them. Honor demands their oaths be followed." End quote.
So to me, this does at least imply that one of those pieces of honor went to fuel the source of the Oath Pact. 10 stand against you, using the piece of us within them.
So yeah, at least one of those pieces went to Kaladin and is the splinter that is making him a herald. All of the heralds got a splinter of honor that makes them a herald, that makes them a cognitive shadow. And so each of them have a piece of honor within them.
That's what seems most likely, and then it's very questionable about where those other few pieces go. And that's what we were speculating on earlier and will do in the future.
But this is the moment when Taravangian begins to understand the unique constraints of the power of honor. And he's a little bit frustrated. He's like, okay, this might be a little bit more difficult than I thought. Honor is very picky about what I can and can't do. But he notices it and he's like, all right, it's fine. I will do better than my predecessors, and I'm just not going to act against Honor's will. I'm gonna keep it happy. He's willing to sort of do the dance to remain aligned with his shards.
For now. Until he gets frustrated enough, is my belief. We'll see.
He is so clever that he might at least have a little bit of an easier time sort of mentally puzzling his way through how can I do what I want to do in a way that the shards are still okay with it? Kind of in the way that cultivation does, in my opinion. That's not in the text, but my interpretation of cultivation is that she also is good at this dance of like, how can I stay within the constraints of my shard's intent and still accomplish what I want to accomplish?
Incredible conversation. We know that we just jumped to the very end of Wind and Truth and really focused on it. We are eventually going to Tarantino the whole situation and go back to the beginning of the book Wind and Truth and then follow many of our major characters and go through their plot points. That's what we have for the future. We have a very fun guest who is going to help us speculate in our next episode. And then throughout the rest of the summer, we are just going to be bringing you a lot of different lore, hopefully some more fun guests, and talking way more about the ramifications of everything we learned in Wind and Truth. Thank you for being listeners. You can rate us and review us. I will read your reviews at any time on any of the platforms of your choosing. Brooke, can you take us away?
Until next time, life before death,
Strength before weakness,
journey before destination.